Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker. She is a well recognized researcher in the field of the intersection of clinical psychology, computer science, and public health with the goal of reducing self destructive behaviors through the use of technology. I am talking about Dr. Chelsey Wilks, Assistant Professor of Health and Data Science at the Department of Psychology at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and affiliate researcher at the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Washington and a clinical internship from the AA San Diego healthcare system. She also was a postdoctoral scholar, Army study to assess risk at resilience in service members, and military suicide research consortium. Additionally, Dr. Wills completed an internship at Microsoft Research, where she received applied training in human computer interaction. She employs methods for data science at human computer interaction to investigate these topics: prevention and intervention of suicide, technology delivered interventions, just in time interventions, and emotional deregulation. Finally, Dr. Wills has extensive research and clinical training in dialectic behavioral therapy, as well as the assessment and management of suicidal behavior. Today, Dr. Wills presents us with the keynote talk, Implementation of Technology to Reduce Suicide and Self-Destructive Behaviors. Welcome, Dr. Chelsey Wilks, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Right. Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction. I feel that made me sound pretty fancy, but without any further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into my talk. I am very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to educate you all on some of the work that I am doing and some of the things that I'm most excited about, and really outlining some of the biggest problems that I see within the field of psychological science. So before I get started today, I actually want to just throw out some disclosures. I received consultation fees for some startup companies, specifically Mindstrong Health, Lyra Health, Click Therapeutics, Behavioral Tech, and I received grant funding from the US government. So everything that I'm going to say today is my own opinion. I'm not speaking I'm not speaking for any of these companies or for the US government. So now that's out of the way, let's get the show on the road. So the United States, at least in the time of pre-COVID, we have done a pretty good job of responding to public health crises. And so what you see here is a proportion of changes in death rates from 1968 onward within the United States. You see this green line of HIV, which was a huge crisis in the 90s, but as such, it's gone down pretty considerably. Now, of course, COVID just really puts a whole wrench in the gears, to use an idiom. However, I think we in this country, in the United States, will probably eventually get it under control, and it will be another public health success, I'm hopeful. However, when we plot suicide on this same graph, basically what we see is something quite striking. It is the only major cause of death, with the exception of COVID, of course, in which rates are actually precipitously increasing over the years. So kind of the question that we in the field of suicide research have been really struggling with is, why is this happening? And so I'm going to go through some of the 4 big problems or reasons why suicide has been such a difficult problem to solve and actually meaningfully reduce. So the first thing is you are looking at where I actually grew up. So that is my house, and I'm from Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, and that's why I have so pale, because I didn't really see the sun until I was 20. But so that's my house there. And what you can see is it is on this road called the Seldom Seen Road. And that is pretty indicative of where I grew up, just in the middle of nowhere in Alaska. And then when it comes to people who are very most at risk for suicide, they live in places like this, places that are isolated, places that are cold, that are, for all intents and purposes, very depressing. And generally speaking, within these places, suicide rates are really high because there's a lack of providers, there's a lack of time, and there's just a lack of money within these very rural communities. But in addition to that, there's also just a lack of clinicians. So again, this is US data that I'm going to be presenting, and the proportions within US data are going to be probably a little different from your countries. It might actually be slightly worse in your countries, but within the United States, there's about 550,000 people that are trained to treat mental health disorders. Also, epidemiological research points to the fact that approximately 25% of the US population will meet diagnostic criteria in a given year. And this is true kind of across countries. About 25%. Epidemiological research says approximately 25% of any given country, somebody will meet diagnostic criteria for a psychological disorder in a year. Now, if we do some math, 25% of the 330 million people that live in the United States equals about 82 million people. And if we divide 82 million by 550,000 clinicians, that gives each clinician in the United States about a caseload of 150 clients per. Now, I don't know, for the clinicians that are listening to this right now, that's probably sounds near impossible. So, and it is, but when it comes to people who are suicidal, there's even less clinicians, there's even less evidence-based treatments. And so it's when the treatment gap between treatment availability and treatment need for suicidal people, it's more like, it's not a gap, it's a canyon. So that's another problem. So we have structural barriers, we just have a lack of clinicians, but there's this other kind of unique problem that exists within suicide, and that's this concept of the suicide help negation effect. So what is that? Suicide help negation is the avoidance or withdrawal of health-seeking behaviors when suicidal thoughts are high. And what I'm presenting here is some research that I did a couple years ago, where I actually kind of replicated the suicidal help negation effect. So what you see here on the x-axis is suicidal ideation total score, and with high scores indicating high suicidal ideation. And on the y-axis is kind of your intention of actually seeking out help. And what you see is this kind of diminished interest in seeking out help when suicidal urges are high. So this is kind of a huge problem, right? So we have lack of structural barriers. We have not a lack of structural barriers, a lot of structural barriers, a lack of trained clinicians, just this overall lack of desire. But let's just assume for a moment that we get somebody who has access to services, who found a clinician that is interested and willing to treat them and who's trained to treat them, and that they want to go to treatment and they're actually sitting in the door of that treatment. There's no guarantee that that treatment is going to be effective. So I'm actually going to be presenting data which are kind of not frequently seen within the world of clinical trial data. So what is this that you're looking at? So these data are from a clinical trial of dialectical behavior therapy that was published in 2015. So it was Marsha Linehan's component analysis of DBT. And DBT is a very, very effective intervention for suicide. It's considered the gold standard treatment for borderline personality disorder. Every single person who was in this study was somebody who received DBT, and not only that, but they received it from Marsha Linehan, they got it from Katie Korslund, Melanie Harned, some of the most expert people who are treating these patients. Each one of these dots represents an instance of suicide acts. And so as you can see, there's an overall trend that the majority of people did well over the course of treatment, but there's a subset of people, and a pretty alarming, a pretty good large number of people that, for all intents and purposes, they did not recover from this treatment. So even through all of this, there's still a possibility that this treatment may not be effective. So I'm going to tackle these problems one by one and think about how we can solve them. So the first problem is treatment is not available for those who want it. Second problem, people tend to avoid treatment. Third problem is there's just a lack of treatment providers with training and willingness to treat suicide. And finally, the treatment may not work. Now, I'm just talking about suicide today. For those of you who treat post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety, I mean, this could probably map on to a lot of the problem behaviors that you are targeting. I just happen to target suicide. That just happens to be my area of expertise. So, as you may have ascertained or guessed from the title of my talk, we have this kind of huge group of people who are either unable or unwilling to enroll into treatment that could have helped them overcome their suicidal urges, desires, behaviors. And that's where technology comes in. Technology is a fantastic tool that can be used to broadly disseminate interventions to anybody who can needs it. Or anybody who even has an internet connection or computational device, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this really exciting new area of research where every single person, I mean, we know every single person actually watching this talk or most people that you're interacting with has some sort of computational device on them at all time, either it be a cell phone or a smart TV or even a smart refrigerator. And all of these devices are collecting a massive amount of data on you. And with those data, we can actually kind of predict what you're doing and how you're doing. And so we can also deliver an intervention to you at very key times. And so I want to talk about both of these things as solutions to some of the problems that I outlined earlier. So the first problem is treatment is not available to those who want it. So in this section, I'm going to just do a review of the evidence-based treatment-delivered interventions, or TDIs, for suicide. I'm going to do a review of commercially available technology-delivered interventions for suicide. And then I'm going to talk about the gaps and the opportunities within this area. So technology-delivered interventions. So before I get started here, this has been kind of an area, a burgeoning area of research that has really exploded over the course of several years. And in my view, there's been about probably at this moment, maybe 500 to 600 randomized clinical trials of a variety of different technology-delivered interventions, and they pretty much point to the same thing. And I'm going to present to you very briefly about some meta-analyses which clump all these randomized clinical trials together, and to give you an idea of, like, in general, the argument is done that these interventions are effective. So mobile interventions for depression, on average, they have a medium pooled effect size favoring the intervention. Web-based interventions for anxiety in youth, they have a pooled effect size that are large, favoring the interventions, indicating that these are pretty good. Web-based interventions for post-traumatic stress disorder, these have a large pooled effect sizes, indicating in general randomized clinical trials for PTSD, they work, they're safe, they're effective, case closed. Web-based interventions for depression, again, large pooled effect sizes favoring the intervention. Web-based interventions for insomnia, large pooled effect sizes favoring the intervention. Mobile-based interventions for anxiety, small pooled effect sizes favoring the intervention. So this is just a handful of these meta-analyses, and I did some color coding. Green kind of means anxiety disorders, blue means depression, and purple is, et cetera. If anybody had any questions about whether these web-based interventions are effective, acceptable, the answer is, yeah, they're effective, they're acceptable, they work, and they actually are being broadly disseminated in large healthcare systems at present. However, there is a good treatment gap for these sorts of interventions for suicide. So when I got into this field in 2015, I did my own meta-analysis of web-based interventions for suicide, and I was interested in, okay, yeah, we know they work, and they're designed to be delivered at scale, but how many of these interventions are actually including populations that are complex or who are suicidal? And the answer that I found is I identified 44 randomized clinical trials in my meta-analysis targeting anxiety and depression. And I found that 91% of these RCTs excluded people at risk for suicide. I also found that 75% of these RCTs excluded people at risk for addictive behavior. And I found that the proportion of probability of clinical change was correlated with the number of exclusionary criteria, such that the more clean the sample, the better the study did. So these studies weren't really being tested or evaluated or developed for complex populations, which then furthers the treatment gap for suicide. So that kind of started me on my line of research to develop and evaluate tools for people at risk for suicide, is that there's just nothing available. And fortunately, from 2015, there has been more of a growth in this area. So I'm going to show you, this is a very, very, very recent meta-analysis that was published, I think, about a month ago, of the randomized clinical trials that have been published that have explicitly targeted suicide. And these are web-based and mobile-based interventions. Franklin et al. Did an app for non-suicidal self-injury. Van Spijker et al. Did a mobile-based intervention for low levels of suicide. That's my intervention for suicide. And then this particular paper, Christensen et al., I did a secondary data analysis with suicide. So in general, what you see here, and this is a forest plot, any of these dots indicate, or these squares rather, they show kind of sample size, and these little whiskers show how broad, how much variability they had in their effect size. But in general, you see is that there's 16 RCTs to date of randomized clinical trials targeting suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. These have small pooled effect sizes. They slightly favor the intervention, but and it comes to the depressions and the anxieties and the insomnias and the PTSDs, we're nowhere close. And the other thing that I want to point out here is that within these interventions, none of these are available commercially. So, including mine. And so I am not doing, I'm a problem. This is very problematic, and I can talk about why that is later. But so then I was interested in kind of a very recent study I wanted to do is, okay, so if somebody is suicidal or they're having suicidal thoughts, what sort of way can they find a mobile application to target their suicide? And what does that look like? And so I did a systematic review of mobile interventions for suicide, really trying to get at what's the quality of these, are they usable, et cetera, et cetera. And so I went to app stores within the US App Store. By the way, I think this would be a fantastic study for people to do in other countries because everything is really flooded and targeted toward US customers. But within the US App Store, we identify apps for suicidal ideation as well as non-suicidal self-injury. We categorize these apps based on evidence-based features that we've known to reduce suicide, such as means safety support, having a panic button, so the ability to contact crisis services ASAP, the availability of a safety plan, as well as did they include some sort of treatment component. We also categorize these apps based on which audience they were designed for, thinking about individuals, teens, clinicians, or friends and family. And then we also did another kind of layer to this is we used a really cool tool called the mobile app rating scale, which is a scale that goes through how usable and engaging are these apps in a very systematic way. And so we trained raters to go through these apps very systematically and to determine how much user engagement of the app. A 0 indicated poor usability engagement, whereas a 5 indicated high usability engagement. And we also rated for daily active users, downloads, as well as star rating. And so what we found within the app stores is there's 66 apps that are just current in the US. If you wanted to find a suicide app, 66, and that's exhaustive. We also found in general, the apps were fairly usable, ranging from a 2.1 to a 4.5 on the MARS. And most of them had a minimum acceptability rating, so that's good. These are the top 5 apps we found on the app stores here in the US. Calm Harm, you can see it's very cute. They kind of walk you through different motion regulation strategies. Talk Life is a support app where you can be connected with different people who are experiencing similar problems to you. I have a little bit of problem of that, but it's another topic. My Support Network is a very highly functional app that can really quickly connect you to people who are supportive. And Mood Tools is a very highly functional app that is designed to really get you into developing a safety plan that you can access really quickly. In general, this is one thing that we found is that the bulk of these apps were really designed for consumers, and a teeny tiny amount of these apps were designed for clinicians. Only 1% of the apps were designed for clinicians, which is interesting because this is what I'm going to talk about this later, is that this is a huge gap in the field. So bulk of the apps are designed for individuals, whether it be adults or teens. And this is the other thing that I found that I think is really important and something we need to consider as technologists and people to develop these tools. People don't really use these apps. So people don't really use these researchers build and develop and evaluate these apps. People build and develop and put these apps on app stores. They don't really use them. So if we look at downloads, about 5,000 for Calm Harm, this is the top app in the App Store, only has gotten about 5,000 downloads, or 28% of all the downloads of all these suicide apps. The top 3 apps, which are here, have about 12,000 downloads, and the top 5 apps have about 15,000 downloads, or 90% of all the downloads of all the suicide apps are only 15% or 15,000, and that's 90% of all the downloads. So nobody's using these. Daily active users, so these are how many people that actually go into the app every single day. We can see about 17,000 daily active users of the Mars, about 45,000 daily active users of the, oh, and by the way, those are monthly downloads, not downloads total. 45,000 daily active users of the top 3 apps, and 54,000 daily active users of the top 5 apps. Now, if we think about the amount of people that are actually thinking about suicide in the United States, and we do some more math, 54,000 divided by the 8.3 million people in the United States who are thinking about suicide, if we're just talking about the United States here, we're only getting 0.65% of ideators actually using these apps. And that is a problem. So the other reason I kind of wanted to explore this is that we actually, if what is going on, what is actually getting in the way of these people downloading these apps. So if I go into my app store right now and I search the keyword suicide, this is what comes up on my app store on my iPhone. Depression test, bipolar test, WISA are the top 3 options. And then I finally get an app that is actually included. This is not a suicide app. This is not a suicide app. And this is not a suicide app. And trust me, I've tried to be in contact with these Google stores and the Apple store to try to get them. When it comes to suicide, maybe you should lay off the profit a little bit and think about actually targeting apps that are really usable or really effective. And it has been to no avail. So this is a problem. So there's, whenever there's a lot of problems, there's, my advisor in graduate school always kind of saw it as wonderful opportunities for research. So for one, we know that these evidence-based technology delivered interventions are for suicide. They exist, they're safe, they're acceptable, they're effective. They have small effect sizes, but they're effective. But we just need more research done in general. We also need to understand that if we build something, that does not necessarily mean people are going to use it. And it also, publishing an app on an app store also doesn't mean that people are going to use it. Also, the other thing, by the way, is that apps on these app stores have virtually no research support. And apps on app stores with research support have nobody using them. So there are apps with research support that are on app stores, but they're unable to be found and nobody uses them. So kind of my recommendations here is we really need to solve this lab to marketplace problem, kind of a dissemination implementation problem, but within the world of technology delivered interventions. I also think that it is not a terrible idea for researchers to partner with industry to evaluate their really well-designed, really expensive technology-delivered interventions in a way that can add some credence and some respectability to what they're developing. Also, I just think there's a total lack of user engagement and human-computer interaction, and just how can we make these apps more interesting and usable within these commercially developed apps, but also research-supported apps as well. So let's get to the next problem, that there's just a general lack of willingness that people have in seeking treatment. So how can technology be used to actually solve this problem? So you should recognize this graph. This is a study that I did about help-seeking intentions among suicidal ideation. Well, that wasn't the only thing that I did with this study. I actually also asked people about their preferences for online treatment. And what I found is this red line here are a willingness for people to engage on online interventions. And you can actually see is there's almost this linear relationship of how suicidal people get as a higher preference to seek out online interventions. And to the point that for people that are very suicidal right here, that that preference for online actually exceeds face-to-face, which is the people that we really want to target. But then when I was actually kind of exploring this data, what I found is what was driving this online help-seeking preference was social media, which is interesting. And so what we see here is on the y-axis here is the Beck scale for suicidal ideation, which is the same thing here. And then means of people that were not willing or not interested in going to using social media compared to people who were willing. And so you see that in general, people who were willing to use social media had on average higher Beck scores, and yes, that is statistically significant. So let's look at, take a moment and think about how we can use social media to identify people at risk for suicide and potentially intervene on them. So first of all, there's been this really interesting world of research that exists within computer science circles about identifying and predicting suicide risk on social media. So there's a lot of different social media sites out there. There's Reddit, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's Tumblr, there's Omega, there's Snapchat, there's Instagram, there's TikTok, and there's probably a whole bunch more. And the green ones are not anonymous and the blue ones are anonymous. And there's been tons of research that has essentially shown that, yes, we can predict suicidality based on Facebook posts or Reddit posts. And there's also even been research that's found that if we loop in somebody's social media into a bunch of other sort of prediction metrics, that we can really greatly improve the prediction algorithm of identifying when people are suicidal and how people get suicidal based on their social media accounts alone. So we know that people tend to avoid face-to-face treatment, but people are very suicidal people are going online and they're using social media to reach out for help or to we really don't understand what they're doing, but they are there. So there's this really amazing and fascinating study that a colleague of mine did at Harvard, who was really interested in identifying these people on social media, but actually encouraging help-seeking behavior. And so what he did, this is Adam Jaworski and colleagues, and published this really fascinating paper in 2019, and they found this thing called a COCO bot. And what they did is it was a prediction algorithm that was enmeshed within a bot. And they actually used people within the app Talk Life, which I mentioned in the previous section, which was an app based on social media for mental health problems. And it predicted people who were at risk for suicide, this automated bot. And when it found somebody that they predicted being at risk for suicide, it encouraged people to use a crisis hotline or suicide hotline. And then this was happening with hundreds of thousands of people. And people were randomized. And so people would say, okay, do you want to use a suicide hotline? they would say yes. If they said no, they were randomized into 1 to 2 conditions. One condition, they would just be like, okay, no problem. The other condition was what Adam and colleagues called this barrier reduction condition, which was to provide some corrective feedback on why somebody might not be interested in seeking out help. So a lot of people, there was just this bot that was already pre-programmed to just be like, what are you worried about? What are your thoughts about? Blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, no, you're not going to go to jail. You're not going to be forced to be hospitalized. Just, it's going to be helpful. And so what they found in the study was that participants who were in the barrier reduction intervention were 23% more likely to use crisis services, which is really, a very simple and elegant intervention that can be just embedded. Now, this sort of methodology, I'm currently working on a project very similar to this using a social media network for veterans called Rally Points, as well as I'm working on a similar project to use for college students. And it's actually done by the same people that do Talk Life. It's called Talk Campus. So these projects are kind of happening. It's all very exciting. I want to give you just a roadmap, or if anybody's kind of interested in like thinking about how this could work within your research program. First of all, you want to identify some sort of platform. It doesn't have to be these huge platforms like Twitter or Facebook, but it can be, a relatively small platform where that people are aggregating that could be at risk for all sorts of things: eating disorders, depression, PTSD, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that you need to do is you actually need to work in an interdisciplinary team. You absolutely need some sort of psychologist, but you also need some sort of person who can do the tech stuff, to do the natural language processing, to detect the suicide risk. This is going to be done, I would encourage it to be done in a supervised machine learning way, which is we need the clinical psychologist or somebody who has that expertise in mental health to code those messages, read a subset of those messages, and then say, yeah, this person's at risk for suicide, this person is not, or this person meets diagnostic criteria for PTSD, I would reckon, or I think this person has PTSD-like symptoms, and this person does not. Then the machine learning person or the natural language processing person runs that through this model, and now you can successfully, moderately, with some degree of accuracy, identify people who could benefit from some sort of intervention. And this is, by the way, with computer science, this is where it stops. It's like, okay, yay, we found some group of people that are at risk for blah. But I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm interested in prevention and intervention. So I like to go one further. Let's develop an intervention. What is it that we're trying to do? What is it that we're trying to change? Are we trying to get people to contact the suicide hotline? Are we trying to get people to use referral services? Are we trying to get people to go to a certain website? That's something that we'd want to think about and build that into the platform if possible, which is, again, you need that sort of buy-in for that platform. And trust me, they are going to be willing and interested in working with you. Then, just like any good scientist, you evaluate it, test it, refine it, and you are saving the world one social media platform at a time. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of research gaps and opportunities here. In general, we do know that suicidal people do use social media, the internet, as a platform for help seeking. However, it's really there's just a lot of research that needs to be done here. It's unclear whether these online communities do more harm than good. Yes, I think. And also, in general, the research is pretty clear that we can predict certain behaviors, but there's virtually nothing on intervening. And that's something that I think that would be fertile ground for people to think about. What the opportunities are is really interdisciplinary research is needed. Also, when it comes to technology, we do, again, have to partner with industry. But also, if we're going to do some prediction, we have to think about what are we going to do? Okay, so what are we going to do once we find these people? How are we going to intervene? We can't just predict and just say good for us and we're done. And then, of course, with all of this is ethics. And now we're going to get into the world of ethics. And this is just an area that we have limited guardrails. on how to govern our behavior when it comes to this sort of technology delivered precision medicine stuff. So that is an area that needs to be explored. So my next problem that we're going to solve and we're moving into today is this general lack of training and willingness within treatment providers. So how do we get treatment providers more comfortable with treating people at risk for suicide and trained up? So this is, again, where technology has been very effective and really helpful in terms of getting people acclimated to technology and how we can use technology as a training tool. So one of my favorite studies is in 2017, a friend of mine, actually two friends of mine, Amanda Gilmore and Aaron Mortzelski, colleagues of mine, both went to my grad school at University of Washington. They published this really wonderful study about therapists and their comfort of treating suicidal patients via telehealth, 2017. And they found that most of them were just uncomfortable. And they were like, I don't want to do it. I'm going to treat my suicidal patients online. So we all know what happened last year. Sorry, it doesn't matter whether you are uncomfortable managing and treating suicide. That's just not going to happen. So everybody's using telehealth regardless of their patient's level of risk. And so I recently am doing a study currently right now to get the therapist perspective on how that is going for them. And generally what I'm finding is therapists are in a pickle. They are having a difficulty finding technology delivered tools that can facilitate treatments. They have difficulty assigning homework and reviewing homework. They have difficulty tracking behaviors in a meaningful way. And then for therapists who are seeing low income clients, it's very difficult to get them to use kind of the better apps that are for a fee. So, and there's also just a general fear of treating suicide. So kind of the general rules or the rule of thumb when it comes to treating suicide within patients or within clinicians is we got to do two things. We got to increase expertise and we got to give people tools. And generally what increases expertise is training and giving people a team of people that they can rely on, but also giving people access to evidence-based tools to manage suicide. So one tool that we use in dialectical behavior therapy, which is a treatment that I'm trained in, is something called the Suicide Risk Assessment and Management Protocol. And so this is a long paper protocol that kind of walks a therapist through how to assess and manage risk. And I was on a team that took this protocol and it translated it to a technology delivered medium called the Suicide Safety Net. And then we did, we had this, the Linehan Risk Assessment Management tool that was computerized. We also added local resources, et cetera, et cetera. And we did an open trial where we recruited 44 clinicians who were treating patients at risk for suicide and who were using the suicide safety nets. And the cool thing that we found is, it was usable, acceptable, feasible, blah, blah, blah. We found that clinicians actually had a higher level of confidence in treating suicide, and as well as a lower degree of fear. So it was this kind of really cool way to use technology as a bridge to increase access to care or increase access to training materials. So in general, technology is a really fabulous tool that can facilitate face-to-face treatments, but there's a huge kind of gulf of services and tools to really help that should be available that just aren't available to help facilitate treatment with clients or with treatment providers. So there just generally needs to be dissemination, implementation, solutions to improve access and delivery for these tools or for clinicians. And we just need more clinical trials for telehealth. So finally, and I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to just blast through this, is this fact that treatment may not be effective. And so I want to talk about a couple things here within this component. And one was with treatment heterogeneity and precision treatments, but also treatment targeting. And this is kind of the more exciting, and we don't really have too much to talk about yet. So treatment heterogeneity. So what is that? Basically what you see here is this graph where anytime anybody goes into a treatment, they're going to have differing outcomes. People are going to come in kind of the same way, but some people are going to do really well. Some people are going to do really bad or not so well. And so when it comes to suicide, there's a lot of different treatments. There's dialectical behavior therapy, which is a very long and complex treatment. There's CAMS, or collaborative assessment and management of suicide. There's cognitive therapy for suicide prevention, and there's suicide safety intervention, or safety planning intervention. So there's a lot of different interventions, and many of these interventions, it takes so much time and effort to get somebody through the door. It would be nice if we could predict whether somebody is going to end up here or somebody is going to end up here. And the way that we do that is through this analytical procedure called precision medicine. So Ronald Kessler, who was one of my mentors on postdoc, is a precision medicine person. And what he did is he took a secondary data analysis of a randomized clinical trial comparing CAMS to treatment as usual. And how you do this is he took a bunch of baseline characteristics that were assessed at time point 1 to develop what's called a precision treatment rule, and using ensemble machine learning to try to predict who was most likely to do in CAMS versus not do well in CAMS. And so CAMS, again, is just a very brief evidence-based treatment for suicide. And what he found was that people in general who had major depressive disorder, lifetime diagnosis of PTSD, low physical functioning, they did well in CAMS. People who had multiple suicide attempts, or people who met diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder, and people who had low social functioning score, they do not do well in CAMS. So this is this really fantastic kind of nugget into this world where if we know that somebody has BPD or borderline personality disorder, maybe we should not give them CAMS. Maybe they should probably do DBT, to be perfectly honest. But this is really at the infancy of research. But there's this other kind of concept of like, maybe our current models of treatment may not really fit well just in general. Right now we've been blaming the treatment, but maybe we just need to rethink therapy in general. So the current model of therapy is if somebody's depressed or anxious or has some sort of psychological symptom, they go to a therapy office or they log into their Zoom with their therapist. And then, the therapist does assessment, treatment planning, does some intervention, and then it's expected that that client is actually going to implement those tips and tricks and tools into their daily life. When there's a whole week that happens between and that they're not being prompted to actually implement those skills. So kind of thinking through is, we know that we use technology that's available for people. Actually, here we go. Yeah, we know that there's technology, that interventions that can be in the pocket of somebody at all times. And I did a study where we took a mobile app. When I was at Microsoft, we created a mobile app based on dialectical behavior therapy. And everybody was kind of had the opportunity to use the app. And the way that we designed the app was in such a way that people would go into this particular skill. They would be prompted on what their distress or emotion rating was. They would go through the skill like 2 minutes later, and then they were prompted to rate their emotion again. And we would get these like really micro pre-post levels. And this is what the app looks like. And what we found was that in general, the majority of people would use the app when they were very distressed. So 82% of the users had a distress rating of 4 or 5 out of 5 when using the app. So they weren't using the app when they were bored, they were using the app when they were distressed. We also found that in general, the emotion regulation module within DBT elicited the largest reductions in distress. We also found that people who use the app in the morning, people who use the app repeatedly, or the skill repeatedly, and had faster reductions. And we also found that people who use the skill problem solving, which is just problem solving, and people who use check the facts, which is just like cognitive restructuring, they had the largest reductions as well. So how does this kind of map on to thinking about how we can think about interventions and using mobile technology a little more strategically, is if we have this concept in DBT called a chain analysis, where we're trying to kind of figure out what are the prompting events that get into suicide. And so we have a suicide attempt here, we might have suicidal ideation here, we might have an urge to engage in some sort of suicidal behavior here. In face-to-face therapy, we might, want our client to use an intervention here, maybe an intervention here, an intervention here. And there's a lot of different ways that we can intervene and think about how we can actually use that using mobile technology. And so people, if they have a smartwatch or a smartphone, we can think about tracking their social, emotional activity or sleep behaviors using all sorts of different sensors on the phone, social media. You can do voice tone, which is we got to think about ethics here. We can do GPS and heart rate, we can do accelerometer and microphone, and all of these signals can really be used to passively target, but then at the same time, they're passively managing and monitoring our behaviors, but can really get into intervening as well. And this is some work that I'm getting into currently. So in general, we know that precision medicine is a fantastic way to really understand how interventions work for whom, but also precision targeting is a great way to think about how we can use computational technology, data science, and machine learning, and interventions to target people at key times. But just in general, this is fertile ground and we need research in this area, and it is inherently interdisciplinary. So just in general, there is, remains a very large treatment gap, even with technology. It's not a panacea, but it is something that can be one if we're thinking strategically about it. We need to be more interdisciplinary, maybe involving industry, and we need to think about how we should actually integrate clinicians and partner them with technology. Finally, we need to think more about how we can use technology as a way to think about precision medicine, as well as just-in-time adaptive interventions or precision targeting. And I'm a little over, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chelsey, for sharing so much knowledge with us. Congratulations on your brilliant presentation. And now we are going to have the opportunity to at least one question, because actually we have a lot of questions, but we are running a little bit out of time. So I would like to start with a question. If you have some input for us about this apps that you mentioned, if they are available in Spanish or in Portuguese, do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so the mobile apps that are available in Spanish or Portuguese, I don't know if there are too many apps related to suicide or mental health in general. Actually, if anybody wants to partner with me and do a study on that, I think that would be really interesting. I can help you. So that's what I would say. That's a gap in general. When it comes to the app that I developed based on DBT, if you want to translate that into Spanish or Portuguese also, it's actually would be pretty easy to do because I have all of the text and just all the content is available in a Excel. So you get in touch with me and I would be happy to work with you and do a study on that.
That sounds great. Very good. So we will do one more question. Is that okay?
Of course.
Are there studies that show the difference in effectiveness of apps intervention when the risk of suicide is associated with other disorders, such as, for example, psychoactive substance abuse?
So let me make sure I'm hearing the question right. Are there technology delivered intervention?
Yes, if you know data with the comorbidity that study the comorbidity, for example, or no, we should probably look for it.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In general, suicide and other things is a really understudied area. Just in general, face-to-face, not face-to-face. DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is probably has the most robust research on co-occurring addictive behavior and suicide. My dissertation was co-occurring alcohol use and suicide. And it was a technology delivered intervention. However, I will say that that is just, the thing is there's just been very little research in that area. And a lot of it is just because I don't know, it's hard research. It's anxiety provoking, but yeah, co-occurring anything with suicide is really understudied. But I think people should do it. I will help you.
Good, perfect. I said I had just one question, but I cannot help myself to do one more, please. Could you give some tips or talk a little bit about how which things shouldn't be done or could be done for suicide risk assessment and intervention in synchronous interventions on online therapy? Because now we are all online, and actually it was brilliant and really exciting hear you about all the studies about asynchronous interventions. But could you talk a little bit about tips for synchronous interventions?
Yeah, as far as suicide risk assessment and management, it's interesting because when I was on internship, I did telehealth, and this was before anybody did telehealth. And I did with US military veterans who have a very high suicide rate. And it's interesting because you even have a better opportunity to do suicide risk assessment because you can see their house. And you can be like, hey, take this tablet to your bathroom and I want to see you flush the pills down the toilet. Or put that gun in a lockbox. This is the United States everybody has a gun. So mostly veterans too. So that's very anxiety provoking to, have your suicidal client playing with a gun. But it gives you a really good opportunity to be like, hey, this is how your life is. I can look at your environment and we can kind of structure it right away. So just be aware that is something you can do. You can think of it as a pro. The other thing that it's just like face-to-face therapy with a client in your living room, or not in the living room, but in your office, where you just are going to ask them, what's their intention, what are their means, is there anybody you can access? The only difference is that you're in their house essentially. So you can really do some actual, like the behavioral interventions that you implement can be more sticky. It's like, okay, well then put that note on your refrigerator so you remember to take your psychiatric medication, or, it's actually, I don't know, I think it's easier, if that makes sense. And then the other thing I'll say is just document everything. That's just good hygiene, is document every little thing, even if you feel comfortable. I don't know if you want to record your sessions, but it might even be best to do that, but just document everything.
Perfect. Oh, Chelsey, thank you so much. We could stay here and listen to you a lot of time and learn from you. Unfortunately, we need to close. So thank you so much. I have no words actually to thank you for your availability and your generosity, in addition to the impactful contributions that you have provided us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, and you stay with us. We will still have a great schedule ahead. Now let's continue with our schedule.